2. This morning, I'd be taking a look at the end of Luke chapter 14. About 3 or 4 weeks back, we covered the front end of this and just didn't have any way to fit this all into one lesson. So I know we've hit a little bit already in chapter 15, and Brother Ken has covered the beginning of chapter 16 for us this last week. But we're going to go back and visit chapter 14 for a little bit here, then we'll jump ahead back into chapter 16, where Brother Ken left off last week. So if you want to, go ahead and grab your Bibles, or if you can follow along with the scriptures, they'll be up here as well. Some of the material I'm going to be presenting today is taken from these folks: Francis Chan, Matt Chandler, James Patrick Holding, and James Stone. Chapter 14, starting at verse 25, and we'll try to go through the end of the chapter today. It says, "Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, 'If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother, and his wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all he has cannot be my disciple. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.'" This first section here, we see that great crowds are following Jesus, as they have been. Excuse me. Crowds where sometimes it would be so dense where Jesus would have to step out into a boat so he could speak to them. Crowds would be dense enough where 20,000 people, just the men that would be around him. And this isn't a place where we can gather people efficiently like we have today. If you're watching the football games yesterday, listen, we've got stadiums built today. We can house 50, 60,000 people in a pretty small area, no problem. But if you're talking about people spread out here over the desert region of Galilee, it's going to be a huge throng of people. It's going to go for quite a ways. Now, what was Jesus' attitude as large crowds were following him? You can kind of think of this as Jesus following, as Jesus crowds. I want us to compare this to kind of our attitude today about great crowds. What happens with us and crowds today? You know, being a minister, I guess I'm on some sort of strange email list, but I get a lot of things, a lot of book offers, and a lot of them kind of look like this. 6 effective ways to get new people through your church door. 10 strategies to get more first-time people to your church. And listen, this is not a bad thing. We need to be drawing in people who don't know Christ. We need to be reaching those who feel that they're only part of an institutionalized church instead of being committed to Jesus Christ. But with Jesus, when great crowds come after him, he doesn't do maybe like we do sometimes. We see, how can we keep these people, right? Jesus, when he had these great crowds coming after him, he didn't handle them with kid gloves, but rather he said, hey, listen, if you're going to follow after me, there's going to be a cost to it. He says here, if you're going to come to me, you're going to have to hate your own father and mother and wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, even your own life, before you can be my disciple. So what's Jesus saying here? Is he saying that we have to hate these people? Now listen, for some of you, this might come kind of naturally, right? But what's Jesus talking about here? The word in Greek here is miseo. We're going to take a look at this a little bit, but I want to do some background into what our notions are of love and hate first. So when we in our country, in our time, in our context here, when you think of the word love, or you think of the word hate, what do you think about? What do you think of? Now, when you think of the word love, maybe it depends on your background or who you are, different things can spring to mind. Anything from a little baby who's shooting a bow and arrow, right? To you can say, well, I love desserts. I love steak. I love a good meal. I love the hogs, right? We use the word love in all sorts of different contexts, and you have to understand the context to understand the meaning. Or when you think of the word hate, what do you think of? Listen, we use the word hate also so broadly and so liberally. It can mean anything from I hate Brussels sprouts to groups that really espouse hatred towards others. Listen, you can say down here, whether you're a Republican or Democrat, you can say, well, I hate those Republicans, they're all fascist, okay? Or I hate those Democrats, they're all socialist. And listen, the problem sometimes with language is we don't know when somebody's saying that if they're using hate in the terms that they hate Brussels sprouts, or they're using hate in the idea that, hey, you're hating like these people hate here, right? So our idea and our speech usage of love and hate is very, very wide, very, very broad. So even in our own language, even in our own context, sometimes we need clarification, because when a person says they love something or they hate something, the actual idea isn't always conveyed to us what they're trying to express. So is Jesus asking you to hate? The short definition of miseo here is to hate or detest. A more complex definition, I hate, I detest, I love less, or I esteem less. Now, there have been some critics who have jumped on and say, well, you know, this Greek word here, it does mean hate. That's its primary meaning, and that's very true. We're going to get into this here. One of these criticisms here says that most Christians feel obligated to soften the face meaning of the word hate to something like love less than me, or even though the Greek word miseo means to hate. And yet I want to point out today that that softening of that word is appropriate when it's translated into our culture and our context. Because the context that this is coming out of is the ancient world, it's the Jewish culture, and it's the Aramaic culture that's going to be translated into Greek. And the use of the word hate in the Bible is an example of linguistic extreme in an Eastern culture. There's no word for like in the Arabic tongue. What this reference is saying here is you can say, I like ice cream, right? That's different than saying, I love ice cream, even though we kind of use those terms synonymously as far as their meaning goes. But if there's no word for like, you use that word, that positive word, love, for every category. The author here says to us Orientals, this includes the Middle East, where Jesus was, the only word which can express any cordial inclination of approval is love. The word is used even of casual acquaintances. Extreme language is used to express even moderate relationships. That's from Abraham Rinby. I'll give you some examples here, both biblical and extra-biblical. Excuse me. Genesis 29, 30 and 31 says, and he went in also unto Rachel, and he loved also Rachel more than Leah, and served with him yet 7 other years. When the Lord saw that Rachel was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. Again, it says right here in the same text, it uses the same thing synonymously about Rachel being loved more than Leah, and Leah being hated. Of course, if Leah was hated, she would have been rejected outright when the deception was uncovered. Judges 14:16, then Samson's wife threw himself on her, sobbing, you hate me, you don't really love me, you've given my people a riddle, but you haven't told me the answer. Again, this is a use of extreme language to make a point. I'm tempted to ask husbands, how many of your wives have ever said anything like this? I don't think I'm going to do that because I don't want to get in that kind of trouble. But listen, we use extreme language sometimes to make a point, right? We see this in the Bible too. We see this also in extra-biblical text. In Poimandres 4:6. And Poimandres is basically, it's a mixture of Greek and Egyptian wisdom literature. Dates back to the 2nd, 3rd century. And there's a text in here that says that if you do not hate your body first, O child, you will not be able to love yourself. So is this thing, even from the time around Jesus, it's not saying that, hey, you have to hate your body to love yourself, but saying that you have to deny certain things. Here's another one that might be a little bit more easy to understand in some of our cultural contexts. It is said that in battle, man must count his own life his enemy for the honor of Sparta. Now, this is from a war song about that same time period. Now, this is not saying that hey, if you're a soldier for Sparta, your own life has to be your enemy, because then if that's true, hey, just go ahead and let them kill you on the battlefield, right? But the point that it's trying to make is it's emphasizing that you need to make your life secondary for Sparta's sake. So this type of language isn't just inclusively found in the Bible. It's found in other texts from the same time period where people would use this type of language, particularly people of Middle Oriental persuasion there. I'm going to give two basic rules to recognize exaggeration in the Bible. Excuse me. The statement conflicts with what the Bible says elsewhere. We can compare Luke 14:26 with Mark 7:10. The literal fulfillment would not achieve the desired good. And this is an example here. Would cutting off one's hand keep one from stealing? Would gouging out one's eye keep a person from lusting? Of course, that's not true. This is going to be very extreme language to make a point. That, hey, it's better to go into heaven blind or maimed than to keep those things which cause you to sin. But we all know that, hey, it's not your hand that causes you to sin, right? It's not your eye that causes you to sin. But those are the expressions of what we use to sin. Back to Luke. No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. This is a passage we covered a little while back, but it brings up the same point. You serve one, but your affections for one should far outshine your affections for the other. How many of you in here do or have had jobs? Okay. Why do we have a job? Okay, at the most basic level, we need something to do, right? Even if you got a lot of money, you need something to do. But for most of us, having a job isn't just a matter of having something to do, right? It's a matter of earning an income. We need money to live. So there is a way that we serve in order to get money. But listen, our affection for things and our affection for money and what it can do is should be far outshined by our affection for Christ. And that's the language that's being used here in chapter 14. Whoops. So the question here is, what is your greater affection for? Who's on the throne of your life? Listen, some people do worship their job. Some people do worship what they can acquire. Some people do worship even relationships in your life. When Jesus said you need to hate, you need to love less, you need to abandon everything else in your life, that includes some hard things that he lists there. That includes your parents. That includes your family, right? And I think that's particularly appropriate for us in this day and age because it's very easy for us as Christians not to do bad, evil things, but it's very easy for us as Christians to make good things our idols. It's very easy for us as Christians to put good things on that throne instead of God, isn't it? It's easy to put our family up there. It's easy to put our spouse up there. It's easy to put our job up there. And those aren't bad things, but that's not where they belong. What's uppermost in your affections in your life? Now, there's a difference between affections and service. If you have a job, most of us, hopefully we like our jobs, right? But there are going to be periods of time probably where you don't like your job, where you're going to do it more out of a sense of devotion because there are things that need to be done. Devotion and affection are two different things. We need both in our spiritual walk. And the question here is where do your affections lie? Because where your affections lie, naturally your devotion is going to creep that direction. It's what's in our heart. What's in our heart is what drives us. Jesus says, "Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple." Now, what does a cross mean? Because in today's society, we do some very cute things with crosses, don't we? We use it as a symbol. We use it as an emblem. We make jewelry out of it. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, all right? But the original meaning of a cross was meant to put someone to death. It was meant to put a criminal to death. It's been a while since I've looked at crucifixion. I was going back about this a little bit this week, delved into the history of Roman crucifixion. These are the basic three ways that the Romans would crucify somebody. And of course, the image on the far right is more the picture we get of how Jesus was crucified. And crucifixion is done by hanging somebody on a cross. They call it a capital Tau cross on the left. It looks like a capital letter T, a lower Tau cross in the middle or on the right-hand side. And this image on the bottom right here, that's actually an ankle bone that was found with a crucifixion spike driven through it. Somebody that would have been crucified in the manner, the image on the left there, where the legs are bolted in to either side of the crossbeam. And crucifixion was typically a way that Rome saved to kill people that are going to be politically dangerous. People that have taken place in uprisings. This is typically done to show people that, hey, you don't cross Rome. When Rome would go and conquer a new vicinity, they might line a road with people on crosses as a warning to other people. So this is going to be it's a very horrific way to die. And the amount of time it would take somebody to die really depended on how much punishment they might endure before the actual cross hanging. Because it's not actually the spikes that kill you up there. It's the fact that eventually your body gets worn out and you can't breathe. You asphyxiate, you suffocate, you die because you can't get air. What they would typically do is if they didn't have your feet nailed on the side, they'd have some way for you to lift your body up because you'd have to lift your body up every time you wanted to take a breath. So they wanted you to support most of your weight on your feet, not on your arms. But eventually, sometimes it would take people many days to die. If you had somebody that was strong and healthy, they could keep pushing themselves up for a long time. But eventually, you succumb to that. Eventually, you can't do that anymore. And of course, we know from Scripture that Jesus endured a lot even before his time that he was put on a cross. And oh man, looking at this week, crucifixion is an ugly business. When you want to put somebody to death, and not just put them to death, but to send a message about the manner in which they're being put to death that says something about them, this is the way you do it. So people in Jesus' day would have been very familiar with the idea, well, who dies on a cross? Well, seditionist, right? So this is the idea that Jesus says, if you want to follow me, you have to pick that up, and you have to come after me. So Jesus is asking us to die. Dietrich Bonhoeffer says, when Christ calls a man, he bids him to come and die. I'll skip that slide there. So why is discipleship so hard? Because Jesus, as great crowds were following him, he doesn't encourage them, but in our modern terms, in our modern thinking, he tries to thin out the ranks a little bit, doesn't he? He's saying, if you're going to follow me, this is going to be tough. You need to count the cost. If you're going to follow me, you need to be able to be willing to give everything else up. You need to abandon everything else. There's a story in the class guide, I'm not sure if there are any more still out there, about a young man who's coming and he's looking at some dogs chase a rabbit. And there's one dog, and he gets out and he chases a rabbit, and pretty soon there's a whole pack of dogs that are chasing behind. You've got the lead dog that's still kind of on that rabbit, but after a while, the other dogs kind of give up chase. And the young man said, well, why is that? Why is it that only that first dog was the one? And the older man said, well, it's because only the first dog could see that rabbit. The other dogs knew that first dog was chasing something, but they didn't know what it was. And the point the man brought out that is our Christian life is a lot like that. Discipleship is extremely hard if you're just following somebody else's example because they can see what they're following. Christianity becomes extremely passionate and easy and aggressive when you're in this story, the lead dog, because you can see what you're pursuing. When you can see Christ, when you can see the goal that's in mind. Just my own observation, we have a lot of people in our culture, in the church today, that aren't following Christ, but at best they're following other people that are following Christ, that aren't in the Bible for themselves, that aren't praying for themselves, but kind of rely on the spiritual leftovers of other people. And listen, if you're not in the Word, if you're not delving into prayer, if you're not wrestling with issues that you have that are hindering you from growing, your Christianity won't keep you. And I think it's why we've lost so many in the church, because they were never chasing after the right thing in the first place. But instead, like all those other dogs, they're just chasing after somebody else that is chasing after something. When you've got that rabbit in sight, there's nothing that's going to keep you from it. But when you don't, everything will. It's one reason discipleship is so hard and why Jesus sets out so many warnings about being prepared to count the cost for following him. And then he goes on to say, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. I want to read some from Matthew that Jesus says concerning salt as well. Matthew 5, starting at verse 13, he says, you are the salt of the earth, but the salt loses its saltiness. How can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. He says, you are light of the world. What's that mean? In part, that means, we're letting our good deeds shine. Why? So that people can see and glorify, not us, but glorify our Father in heaven. Our good deeds should be done in such a way that people realize that this isn't just coming from our heart. This isn't just coming from us. But this is actually work of God. So one thing this means is that since we are the light of the world, this means that we're not just supposed to be, listen, a city on a hill can't be hidden, but we're not supposed to be a monastery. We're not supposed to be closed off from the rest of the world. We're not supposed to have a circle the wagons mentality that says we're going to keep to ourselves and just be holy to ourselves. But rather, Jesus says, if you're my disciple, you are the light of the world. You are the salt of the earth. We're going to be going out among the world and living with them, being salt and being light. I heard someone say, and I think it's very, well, he said Christians are like manure. Have you heard this? He said Christians are like manure. If you spread it around, it does a lot of good. But if you let it sit in one place, it starts to stink real bad. And his point was this, that listen, if we're just going to sit around and be in a church building, if we're just going to sit around and be by ourselves and to ourselves, we're going to start to stink. Not just to the world, but to each other. You know this is true, right? Some of you have been in churches where this happens. Where you become so focused on yourselves, what happens? You start to argue about little tiny stuff, don't you? Listen, it gets this way on a rainy day in some houses, doesn't it? You can't go outside for a few days, and all of a sudden what happens? Boy, your husband, he's a lot more irritating than normal, isn't he? Am I right? Listen, this happens in the church too. I heard another guy say that, a donkey can't kick while it's working and doesn't work while it's kicking. I thought that's another great description of the church. If we're not working and we're not working together, hey, our tendency is to kick at each other, isn't it? And just like that big pile of manure, hey, we're supposed to be used for something. We're supposed to be spread out. We're supposed to be salt and light. We're supposed to be adding taste, adding flavor, adding a preserving element to the world that's around us. There's a book I have in my office. It's a pretty good one called Daily Life at the Time of Jesus. And it's kind of it's an interesting thing if you're just curious about the time period, about everything from coinage to things like this. Of course, in Jesus' day, there were no refrigerators, right? Refrigerators didn't become popular in the United States until probably the turn of the 20th century. My grandmother had a green refrigerator like this, and I remember going over there when I was a child. Every once in a while, we'd have to defrost it, because remember, they didn't have the automatic defrosters back then. It would get, the 2 inches of frost on there, and you'd have to open it up, and they'd yell at the kids and send us out of the room, and I'm not sure exactly what else happened. But in Jesus' day and time, you would use salt as a preservative. You'd put fish in a salt solution or sometimes a pickled solution to preserve it. It was the high salt content that would keep it from rotting. And salt was also added for flavor. Salt cuts through the bitterness of some vegetables. And there was a very high demand for salt. I didn't realize this. I just got to researching salt a little bit this week. But there was a time where there were salt routes, actually, and where salt would get to be so scarce. Actually, the city of Venice owes much of its influence and power to the fact that they had access to a lot of salt mining. So they would go down to, I think it was Alexandria, and trade Venice salt for spices from Alexandria. And a lot of people in the city became very wealthy. Because people realized you need salt not only to preserve and to flavor, but hey, you need salt to live. In more ancient times than what we're talking about now, people would hunt because they could recognize where animals would go to. They go to natural salt deposits because there's usually not enough salt just in vegetation, so animals would find their way to salt. And once we moved to more of a farming community instead of a hunting community, people realized, hey, we need to have more salt in our diets. Now, they don't have, of course, the medical knowledge that we do today, but you can see the effects of people that don't have enough salt in their diet. Of course, we probably see the opposite today. So Jesus says, you are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It says something similar in Luke 14:34, but the salt has lost its taste. How such saltiness be restored? And take you back to high school chemistry for just a minute. I hated chemistry in high school, okay? But in college, I really loved it. So I think teachers make a difference. But you have your sodium, your Na, your Cl, your chloride. They come together and form what we know as table salt. And here's the thing about salts. If it's not NaCl, it's not salt. So you can't actually have salt not be salty because of its chemical composition is what makes it salt. So what's Jesus saying here? Well, there are three ways that this might happen, particularly that would be familiar in the minds of Jesus' hearers. And remember, Jesus is speaking to a large cross-section of society. He's speaking to Gentiles, he's speaking to Jews, he's speaking to well-educated Pharisees, he's speaking to other people who are not educated at all. But all of them would be very familiar with salt. Jesus' Hebrew listeners could relate to the first. Dead sea salt could leave a bad taste in your mouth under the right or wrong conditions because of the amount of impurities, boron, magnesium, and bromides in the water. If the sodium chloride in the compound were to dissolve, its saltiness would give way to other yucky flavors you wouldn't want to sprinkle all over your food. Hence, Jesus' audience at the Sermon on the Mount lived not far from the Dead Sea, so they got the point of this parable. So this is one way salt can lose its saltiness. If you have the actual sodium or sodium chloride elements of it dissolve, it's going to leave the other elements that are there. And at this area of the world, that's going to leave a very bad-tasting compound. The second way it can happen is through reformation. And basically the same thing, where you know this if you got salt in your house. If you put a little bit of water in there, what happens? Where that water hit, it becomes a different consistency after a while, doesn't it? It dries, it recrystallizes, but it bonds with the water and it becomes kind of a different element, so it loses some of its flavor, its saltiness. Now, the third way is through dilution. You might have unscrupulous people marketing that would not sell pure salt, but salt diluted with other materials. We have these ways that salt can be made unsalty, as it were, okay? And the reasons I list these, because I want you to think about, as Jesus is saying this, ways that, as God's people, we lose our saltiness, okay? Ways, as God's people, we lose our ability to be light to the world. I'm going to get into that here in just a minute. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "And we all who are with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever-increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit." So what happens when you become a Christian and you're baptized into Christ, you obey the gospel, the Spirit comes, and through the Spirit's working in your life, you become salt, okay? You become a person who all of a sudden says, you know what, this sin is not good. This is something in my life I need to work on. And after that process and through that process, and because of that process, we're also able to become light to the world. Because after we are changed, as we undergo the process of sanctification, people see that there's that change in us. That's how it's supposed to happen. But what often happens, particularly in our day and age, is we have a desire for knowledge, but we have little desire for transformation. I want you to hear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. Knowledge is good. We need to pursue knowledge, particularly knowledge of the Bible. There was a day and time when we were known as a people of who knew the book, right? Book, chapter, and verse. Do you remember this? I grew up in a church that was kind of that way. I have since been in places where there is a very strong push towards what I would call anti-intellectualism. Where people don't want to see you pursuing knowledge because it well, I'm not going to get, I guess, into all that, but people don't want to see you pursuing knowledge for the sake of Christ. But what's happened, I think we've let the pendulum swing the other way, where we have a great desire for knowledge, and we teach a great desire for knowledge, as we should. But we have little desire to transform. We have little desire to apply what we know. I want to illustrate this way. This lady here, up at the top. Boy, 60 days, that's pretty good, right? Now, I've heard it's harder for ladies to lose weight than men, okay? Andrea tells me this all the time. And actually, we'll go on the same diet together, and I will lose a lot quicker than she does. It's just part of the way our bodies are made up. So for this lady to do this in 60 days, that's pretty good. She probably had a plan, right? So if you wanted to know something about losing weight or getting into shape, you might go to her and ask, right? She might be considered somebody who has knowledge on that subject. Why? Because you can see the results. I'm going to give you another illustration. If you saw a bunch of people who are very overweight, very obese, talking about a particular subject, and that particular subject was how to be in shape and how to lose weight, okay? And not only did they claim to be experts at this, but they would get mad at you for not doing it. How would you view them? I think you'd be viewed as a fool if you told others how to eat if you fell in this category, right? Because listen, you can have the right knowledge, and that's good, but if you don't apply it, what happens? People will think you're a fool. This has happened in the church because we become masters of information but not masters of life. We have a desire for knowledge, but we aren't a people that transform. Because look, when you compare the church and the world, we don't do any better than the world does. When it comes to divorce, when it comes to consumerism, when it comes to debt, when it comes to lust, when it comes to affairs, when it comes to gluttony, and I could put a bunch of other stuff up here. By and large, we look no different than the world. And yet, we tell the world this is how you should live. But we tell the world how they should live. We have ministers who are falling into affairs. We have Christians who are saddled with debt. We can't go to the world and say, look, this is why Christianity is better. You should live this way because it does have some benefit on this earth. Now, that's not why we become a Christian. But we can't look to the world and say, hey, Christian marriage is better because of this. Because we're not doing it any better than they are. And we become like the overweight people in the room, not just saying we have the knowledge, but getting mad at people who don't do it. Do you get what I'm saying? I've been on a diet for 8 weeks now. I lost 18 pounds, okay? Help me keep at it. But listen, if we're overweight, and I go to my friend over here and say, hey, you know what, you're wrong for eating this way, he's going to call me a fool. If we in the church look at society and say, this is the way you should live, and are not living that way, they're going to think us a fool. And they should. And isn't that our role now in culture? want to talk to you for a minute about Christendom. How many of you did this on the left when you were growing up? Pledge of Allegiance. Every morning, right? We did this when I was a child. Grew up in a military house, so we moved around a lot. Got to be on base housing. So maybe this was practiced more than most. But hey, Pledge of Allegiance, right, to the flag every morning. What are some words in the Pledge of Allegiance that are really offending people nowadays? We're one nation under God, right? See, for the past, many centuries, the place of the church has been an influence on culture. The place of the church has been salt and has been light in the culture that we're in. Whether it was higher education, whether it's politics, whether it's medicine, whatever it was, that field was heavily influenced by the church. We've come to a place now where that is no longer the case. This influence that the church has had on culture, it's gone. It's dead. And if it weren't for conservative pockets of people, we would probably mirror Canada or Europe. I think we're less than a generation behind them in this regard. The church has lost her place in culture. Why is that? It's because the salt has lost its saltiness. Because we believe, but we're no different. So what's left except for us to be trampled on by man? The point is, belief with no transformation gives us the role of fool in culture. Do you feel trampled on as a Christian for your beliefs? By and large, that's the fault of the church, us as the church, because we claim to believe and yet we're not transformed. We don't walk in what we believe in. I think a lot of us today would be able to say this: I believe a lot more than I operate in. And that's the whole basis for this way that we've come to be viewed in our society. We're no longer salt, we're no longer light, because we claim to believe something, and yet we don't operate in that belief. So what has led us to that? What are some of the spiritual battles that we need to fight? Just 5 things very quickly here. First is an undue emphasis placed on width rather than depth. And I'm not just talking about numbers here, although that kind of plays into it a little bit. But when I say width rather than depth, there's much more a mechanism in the church that asks, what do you know, rather than how are you applying what you know. We're much more comfortable seeing what someone knows rather than seeing how do you walk in what you know, right? Danny's been doing a great job this year with his series on discipleship. But I want to put to you that, I think many of us in the church don't understand what that is, because we've never walked in it. And I would bet that most of us in the church, we don't understand the process, because nobody's ever walked with us in that, and we've never walked with anybody else. And listen, there have been some things that have happened in our history that have been kind of scary that way, with people trying to control others. I grew up in a time where the Boston movement was very big, and I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's basically, I have a friend that was in that, and he came out and he would not pray in public for years. He'd been very scarred by the controlling methods there. But I think we lose a lot when we say that, hey, we're not going to disciple at all because some people might abuse that notion. We need to be a place where we can come in and say, not just what do you know, but how are you living in what you do know? We also have experienced the disintegration of genuine, real community. Listen, part of Christian community is being able to lovingly confront the people that are in your life, right? Have you ever done that? Has anybody ever done that to you? Listen, even under the best of circumstances, that's hard. Because what we tend to do as people, when somebody comes to you with something that they perceive that you're sinning in, what happens? Well, most of us, our immediate reaction is to find some sort of sin in their life to justify what we're doing, right? And we think in our minds, hey, get that log out of your own face before you come talk to me about this speck, right? And because we're so afraid of what people think of us, we don't form the relationships that are close enough and accountable enough to be able to say, for a brother to come to me and correct me when I'm wrong. I'm very thankful I've got a man in my life that's like this, and it's hard that he doesn't live close by me anymore. But where we can come, not only we can pray for each other, but where we can share our weaknesses with each other, where we can hold each other accountable. Another thing with community is part of it is allowing others to serve you, okay? A lot of us have no problem with serving others, but when it comes to our being in need and people serving us, we're very uncomfortable with that. I didn't realize the word underwear would be so prominent there. This is a book. It's called Life in Intentional Christian Community. It's called Living in Your Underwear, which is a horribly shocking title, right? But the point of the book is there should be a community of men. There should be a community of other men that you feel comfortable enough walking in a vulnerable position. Women, there should be a community of women that you have in your life that you feel comfortable walking enough in a vulnerable position. That's the title, In Your Underwear. And, you know, us guys, it's hard to fathom because we don't have any problem with that when it's just the guys, right? Women, we're a little bit more sensitive to that, but hey, we need to be able to open ourselves up and let people see who we are. Another thing is lack of submission to authority. Listen, the church is built as a place where those who are spiritually strong, those who are spiritually mature, can speak into, can pray for, can walk alongside, can correct and encourage those who are spiritually weak, right? But we live in such a consumeristic mindset and a consumeristic culture, this just doesn't get done. We have no spiritual authority in our life that's able to speak into us. Listen, if you've ever had a trainer before, a trainer is going to tell you to do some things you don't want to do. But you understand that that's going to be for your ultimate benefit. And that's what I mean when I say authority. How many spiritual trainers have you placed over your life? They can look at you and say, hey, this is where you're wanting to go. Let's help each other get there, and can speak specifically into issues in your life. Fourth thing is an overemphasis placed on drawing people in. I want to be careful here because this sounds bad. But we emphasize often drawing people in more than we do building people up spiritually. We're spiritual contributors, not spiritual consumers in the church. And there's a difference. I was talking with Jonathan Albright about this week. He turned me on to a book. There's a difference between the attractional church and the missional church. In the attractional church, we evangelize or outreach by marketing to people to get them to come to us. We try to produce events and worship gatherings that are attractive to a demographic. That's the attractional church. That's typically how we do it. If we want somebody, more Christians, we say, hey, invite people to church, right? And there's a difference between that and the missional church. The missional church says our evangelism is relational. We invest in people in society, living out our faith in Christ. We find ways to go and live like Christ with people in their regular, everyday activities. Living like Christ is distinctly different, but not irrelevant. It's a difference between come to church with me or be the church with me. And that's a very big difference there. Last thing here, we're a culture built on speed. Listen, even when you're going out for a weekend meal, you hate to wait 20, 25 minutes, right? We have drive-thrus for faster service. We have microwave meals that are just proliferating the supermarket. But listen, sanctification isn't something that comes quickly. Matt Chandler says, when I think about sanctification, a couple of things immediately pop into my head. One is how slow it actually is. I think everyone wants the silver bullet, the thing that makes sanctification move like a superhighway rather than the dirt path that it is. The other is that by and large, the greatest single asset in ongoing sanctification is a serious pursuit of joy in the face of Jesus Christ. Now, I'm not talking about justification here because you're justified when you're baptized, but I'm talking about sanctification, the process of our spiritual growth. And it's hard because we don't see that growth. We want instant results, and sometimes sanctification is going to take years. You're going to deal with an issue, a struggle for years. Oh, we're out of time here. I'm going to have to fast forward here. A couple of questions I want you to ask this morning based on this text is, one, where do I need to be obedient? Where do you need to be obedient? You know the areas of your life where this is true. Another one is, what has the Lord asked me to do historically that was obedient to for a season and then walked away because it wasn't happening quickly enough? Listen, for some of you, this is going to be a relationship. For some of you, it's going to be a sin that you struggled with and it got to be too much, so you just gave up. And that sin is still in your life today. For some of you, it's going to be the fact that you're not joyful, that you're not giving, you're not generous, okay? And you decide to give up. You decide to be like the people around you. Our call is to be salt and light. We do that by wrestling with ourselves. We do that wrestling to grow, wrestling with our sin, wrestling with God, so that we can become salt. And that through that process of becoming salt, we become light as well. Thank you.